Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the very final session of our 3-day annual conference on the foundational economy. I'm delighted to say we've got another wonderful panel of speakers, beginning with the Deputy Minister for Climate Change, Lee Waters, and then we've got 3 excellent respondents in the form of Professor Julie Froud from University of Manchester. We've got Andy Middleton from TIFF, and we've got Gary Newman from Wood Knowledge, Wales. Before I introduce Lee, I have to mention a few of the usual housekeeping rules. Could I ask everyone, please, to remain muted during the presentations, simply because that improves audio quality. Remind the audience that it's being recorded. The protocols for asking questions are the same as we've been using, namely, raise your hand on screen, raise your hand in the reaction bar, the yellow hand, or indeed write your question into the chat function and I'll call you out when we're ready. If you're using Twitter, we're on hashtag foundational renewal and hashtag foundational economy. And anybody who wants to know more about these events can find the details on the websites of WISERD or indeed on the foundational economy website as well. So as I said, we are delighted to have the Deputy Minister with us this evening. Lee has been referred to a number of times in the conference so far. Sometimes he's seen as the grit in the oyster of Welsh politics. Other times he's been called the great disruptor of Welsh politics. Of course, from a foundational point of view, Lee, those are compliments. I should stress that without further ado. So when you're ready, Lee, over to you.
Well, thanks, Kevin, and everybody. I have been called worse, but I really do appreciate the invitation. I think this is a really important gathering. I think you've had a fantastic program, and I am live from Llandudno, which I thought could be the title of a pretty shitty late night talk show spin-off, but it's just me. I'm very tired in a near empty government building. I'm in the north for a series of visits about the new portfolio, which includes, wait for it, housing, energy, transport, planning, regeneration, environment, digital, I think there's some others. It was initially described as a climate change super ministry, but it could equally be called a foundry for the foundational economy, tackling the fallout from global warming, a nature and climate emergency, and stopping it getting any worse is our priority. But as we do it, we need to fashion solutions that also enhance our communities, advancing social justice and growing local economies as we go. And that's the lens I look at this job through. The scale of the climate challenge is not fully understood by many, I don't think. In the next 10 years, we have to achieve cuts in emissions greater than all the reductions that we have managed in the whole of the last 30 years. And the cuts get more challenging still in the decades beyond this one. Now, the first thing I did when I sat down with my colleague Julie James, the Minister for Climate Change, was to scan where our biggest challenges are in order to apply some early energy to get things shifting. Now, while it is often hard to see the woods from the trees, Wales's lagging stats on woodland creation pointed to a real problem that requires immediate attention. The UK Climate Change Committee tells us that if we are to have any hope of meeting our net zero targets, we need to plant 86 million trees in Wales in the next 9 years. That's 5,000 hectares of woodland a year, every year, and that target goes up significantly for the next decade. Last year, we planted 290 hectares of woodland. We've not managed to plant more than 2,000 hectares in my whole lifetime a year. So going from 290 to 5,000 and sustaining it is a challenge we must focus on. So I led an initial deep dive exercise with a small group who were empowered to be challenging, to identify barriers to tree planting and to identify ways of overcoming them. I set ourselves a non-negotiable and tough short-term deadline. And just before the Senedd broke for the summer, I set out our initial conclusions and issued a call to arms to get this sorted and to do so at pace. Now, the point of this example is that here's an imperative to tackle climate change, not a nice to do, but a must do, but it's also an opportunity. We need to change perceptions of Welsh timber from being a staple for low value products like pallets and fencing to one which is used for precision engineering, high quality, low carbon house building, a stimulus for a new program of high-tech green skills, a source of value-added home insulation products. Now, demand for all of these is rising and will get higher. There's a projected 120% increase in global demand for timber for house building. But just 4% of Welsh wood is currently used to build Welsh homes. So what an opportunity we have to disrupt this and create a green dividend for Wales. The trees we plant are essential not just for addressing the climate and nature emergencies, but they provide an economic opening too. Our coal economy is gone, but a new wood economy is available to us if we mobilise an alliance for change. Now that mantra, an alliance for change, Carol Williams's mantra, has made an impression on me, and it's not surprising as Carol and I have been in the thick of the action over the last 3 years, working together, helping guide our Foundational Economy Challenge Fund through the pandemic, working closely with us and how we responded to the PPE challenges in a way that helped local firms. And since the election, bringing his Gramscian blend of intellectual pessimism and optimism of the will together, working with me in our tree deep dive, and now bringing life back into town centres. And I'm really grateful to him and to Kevin Morgan, who has demonstrated, as ever, similar commitment and application for recognising the need to put academic research alongside practical implementation in the bowels of a devolved government, working with civil servants and ministers to tackle familiar problems in fresher ways. Now, as a result of this fusion, when I announced the results of our trees deep dive, I also announced the beginning of work on a timber industrial strategy for Wales and a piece of work on how to draw in finance to fund tree planting in a way that keeps control and wealth within our communities. This is foundational thinking in action, building the wealth of communities, harnessing the everyday economy within our environmental limits, and doing it by building a coalition of the willing, an alliance for change, if you will. Now, for my next assignment, I'm going to be doing a similar deep dive exercise this autumn on the barriers to renewable energy. Same principle, bring together some awkward people who are involved in daily delivery to find a set of levers that help us tackle climate change and help us nourish the foundations of our local economies. As I mentioned a moment ago, the portfolio has, alongside forestry and energy, housing, transport, planning, the environment, regeneration. And in terms of the everyday economy, the foundational economy, there's lots of potential to play with there. In transport, we have a very ambitious target of a zero emissions bus fleet by 2028. It will require hundreds of millions of investment. It's a climate must. It's also an economic opportunity. But without a deliberate and activist strategy, new buses will be bought by our incredibly fragmented bus industry from China and elsewhere. Indeed, it's already happening. But if we can now build trains in Wales again, why can't we build electric buses? Innovative and determined Welsh Government civil servants and ministers saw the opportunity of a new Wales rail franchise in 2018 to harness the power of public spending to create quality Welsh jobs. And with targeted inward investment, we now have Spanish-owned CAF assembling and maintaining 70 trains in Newport for Welsh passengers. No more hand-me-down trains in our railways. Made in Wales wagons are currently being built and tested here. So let's try and do similar, and let's do better. For the new buses, we're going to need to meet our climate targets. Let us aggregate demand and create a domestic supply chain, making sure we capture the value from this spend in Wales. Again, here is foundational theory and practice coming together again. We need to aggregate demand according to the book. So let's roll our sleeves up and do it. It won't be easy. Carol Williams, again, is currently working with civil servants and the brilliant James Davis, Head of Industry Wales, a partnership they forged in the Foundational Economy Ministerial Advisory Board and honed in the work on PPE procurement to figure out a plan. And once we have the foundations, we'll need to marshal another Alliance for Change to make it happen. It's doable, but only if we set out to do it. In housing, I've asked Debbie Green of Coastal Housing, another pioneer in seeing the imperative of applying foundational thinking to the work of social landlords, to bring together a small group to work with us on taking forward the foundational economy agenda in housing. This is a key sector for mainstreaming the principle of social value in practice. And there is already a lot of good work going on that we can build on. And it's important to say at this point that this work has been building in Wales for years, not led by the government, but by civil society. And parts of the social housing sector have been at the vanguard. And this is the work of teams. I'm acutely aware that Carol and Kevin and Debbie are supported by teams and collaborators who come together to ensure that the whole is greater than the parts. Practitioners and researchers feeding in ideas and challenge, doing what Raymond Williams challenged us to do. To be truly radical is to make hope possible, he said, rather than despair convincing. And that's what the foundational economy movement in civil society has been doing. And I want government to put rocket boosters under the important work that has taken place to mainstream and to scale it. Easier said than done. Over 2 years ago, we set up the £4.5 million Foundational Economy Challenge Fund to experiment and trial different approaches. And this included supporting housing associations in Blaenau Gwent to examine the local supply chain to help local firms benefit from spending on optimised retrofit programmes. The fund also supported Keith Edwards, another pioneer, to take forward his groundbreaking work that he developed with others more than 10 years ago on a can-do approach to procurement in social housing. That same philosophy is being advanced by the Centre for Local Economic Strategies in their work with us, with 5 clusters of public service boards. We have these in Wales as part of the Future Generations Act, all the main anchors in an area working together. The public sector in Wales spends some 6.7 billion each year on procurement, and we're determined to make strides to stop that money leaking from local economies. Now, the emerging focus of this work with the local anchors is on localising procurement spend and shortening supply chains. And the public service boards are showing an enthusiasm to focus on increasing local sourcing of food, the development of green skills, support the optimised retrofit programme in social housing, and a specific focus on decarbonisation of supply chains. Again, this is work that helps reduce carbon emissions and brings local economic benefit. Now, this afternoon, I've been to Bethesda to see the determined work being done by Cadeirydd who are working on environmental projects and growing social enterprises in ex-slate mining communities, helped by the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund and learning from similar projects and inspiring people in neighbouring communities. Genuinely organic local leadership, building a movement and an alliance for change. Now, I was rightly told off by Kevin Morgan for saying that we were making up the foundational economy approach as we went. The Basques, he said, learn from the Basques. They say we build the road as we travel. Diplomatic as ever. Lesson learned, painfully. We are building the road as we travel, 1 mile at a time. And the purpose of the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund was to trial, to experiment. 47 projects were completed at the end of March, and they've now been evaluated. And my colleague Vaughan Gethin, the Economy Minister, has just announced a £2.5 million programme to spread and scale some of the good practice that emerged. And that fund is prioritising work in social care, advancing schemes to help recruitment in the sector, furthering a programme of work experience for adults with learning difficulties, and scaling the micro-care model in Flintshire to improve the quality of care and the pay of carers. In Carmarthenshire, we're giving extra support to the local food sector with funding for producers to cook and freeze produce for sale. In Gwent, we're backing a further programme of community wealth building with local anchor institutions. Across the Central Valleys, we're funding a programme to grow the digital capability of 1,000 high street businesses to set up delivery and click and collect services. And in the Northern Valleys, complementing our work on tree planting and timber harvesting, we're supporting a promising project to help deprived communities manage the landscape that surrounds their villages, to shape and benefit from the environment across their skyline. We're also extending support for a community of practice to spread the learning and to help build alliances for change. The experience of working together on securing PPE supplies in the pandemic was instructive. We all had reliance on low-cost goods from long international supply chains. And when the crisis hit, it fell apart. Now, thankfully, we were very well placed to respond with resilience. Our professional and planned procurement systems through NHS Wales shared services came into their own. Whereas the NHS in England was fragmented, the more cooperative systems in Wales across health and social care pulled together. Not only did we not run out of PPE, we were able to offer mutual aid to the NHS in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And as recent audit reports have shown, we did it at significantly lower cost and without any whiff of scandal of contracts given to political chums. A key learning from this experience, though, was the need for resilient local procurement. We saw the appetite of Welsh firms to retool in the crisis, and there is a willing band of capable SMEs who want to supply the public sector and who are more than capable of innovation. And through our joint working with industry, the NHS, and social care, we've been looking at opportunities for reshoring manufacturing, not just of low-cost goods from low-cost countries, but higher value goods, which are currently sourced from high labour cost countries, such as Germany and the USA. And there are plenty of opportunities where we are spending significant sums, from medical devices to artificial hips, that could be made in Wales. There's a significant opportunity, but it will require planned and purposeful intervention from an Alliance for Change for the potential to be realised. And as part of our recent announcement of next steps, I'm delighted that we'll be funding a £500,000 foundational economy health plan. And this is to look at how the NHS can deploy its power as a major anchor institution to stimulate local supply chains. And this will not only address population health by improving local prosperity, but it will cut carbon with shorter supply chains. And the intention is for our NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership to spend an extra £8.4 million with local businesses, getting the public pound working for Wales. And I truly think this is just the start of it. On top of this, our manifesto commitment of a backing local firms fund, which will focus on food, green skills for energy efficiency, measures in social housing and social care. The public sector has a leadership role to play in stimulating change. But let's be clear that the prize is wider. While the public sector spends around 90 million each year on food, and we want to do more to ensure that benefits local producers, this is just the equivalent of the annual turnover of one major supermarket to the west of Cardiff. The annual overall spend with supermarkets and the hospitality sector from consumers in Wales amounts to around £3 billion each year. So to reduce food miles and the carbon impacts of food imported from around the world, our challenge is to deliver a climate change dividend and to boost our local economies. And our Backing Local Firms Fund will take steps to help us to do this. And of course, none of this is easy. And my great frustration is none of this can be delivered quickly either. And that's the challenge we all face. The UN has said the climate crisis is a code red for humanity. It demands significant changes to the way we go about our business. And it demands them quickly if we'd have any hope of stopping climate change becoming a runaway phenomenon. The changes are not optional. The only option we have is, do we let dramatic change happen to us, or do we take heed of the warnings and manage the change? And the foundational economy movement gives us a framework to help us manage the change in ways that also benefit the everyday essential services we all rely on. As our experience in Wales over the last 3 years of trying to put these foundational economy principles into practice shows, it can be done through research, analysis, and action by a coordinated Alliance for Change. Growing up, I used to listen to the Max Boyce album, The Incredible Plan, repeatedly. And you can do no better for a political philosophy, because as he said, where there's a will, there's a way. Diolch.
Many thanks, Lee. That was a truly first-class presentation, typically frank and typically honest, covering both our achievements in Wales as well as our shortcomings. And I think that's the only way to summarise our performance in recent years, that we've got things that we can be inspired by that we've done, as well as being honest and frank about our shortcomings and our challenges. But I think you've pointed a way there for us to address those shortcomings. So without further ado, let's go right away to our three discussants. Before then, we'll open up for comment and questions. Julie, will you kick off, please?
Thanks, Kevin. Hope you can hear me. So thanks very much for the opportunity to comment, and thank you to Lee for his talk. As Kevin said, he's the politician who's sponsored the foundational economy most visibly and effectively in Wales. And for that reason, lots of us have been waiting to see how the foundational economy is going to figure in the new government. And the good news certainly seems to be there's lots going on. The foundational economy has broken out of the economy ministry, and it's connecting with many of the systems that we need to sustain us, and also the systems that need renewal, the housing, transport, forestry. Lee used his very nice phrase about, his new ministry is the foundry for the foundational economy. Certainly the key to solving climate change lies in many of these systems. Now, I expect that my fellow discussants will probably want to talk perhaps a little bit more about some of these systems in a bit more detail. So in my comments, I want to take a slightly different tack. I want, first of all, to reflect on some of the themes that have been highlighted through our three-day conference. And then secondly, pose a couple of questions to Lee about how we take the foundational economy forward as a way of thinking and enabling thinking and doing in Wales. So I'll start by looking back over the last few days. And the earlier sessions in this conference, I think, have highlighted some really important themes for those of us who want to develop and use the idea of the foundational economy. And it was really nice that Lee mentioned some of these in his talk. So I think that's quite encouraging. So those of us who have been at the conference all week, we started on Tuesday with a keynote presentation from Hilary Cottam. And the discussion in that session was around this question about what makes a good life. Now, that's a theme that really should underpin everything that we do, whether we're academics, policymakers, practitioners. Striving towards a good life for all is something that should be there, but often gets lost. Either we don't focus on it directly, or we make assumptions about what a good life is for other people. And we kind of assume that a good life is going to be the outcome of policy. And instead, in that session, it was very clear from the discussion, from Hilary's presentation, that what we need to do is to co-design the idea of a good life and how we get there. And I think it was a very nice way to set up the conference. And I think Lee's presentation at the end kind of is a nice way of thinking about what does all this mean in terms of politics. And in this discussion about a good life, the importance of community and communities was at the centre of this, and giving voice to communities, enabling communities to be what they want to be, and thinking about how that should be supported, not to leave communities to themselves, but to support them effectively, were threads that came through the discussion in our first day. And important to bear in mind that communities can be place-based, but they can also be occupationally based. So again, we think about occupations like care, that's a community, but it's not always a place-based community. And so the idea about community and communities really is central to the idea of renewing and strengthening the foundational economy. Another key theme for us has been revaluing investment in services like care, seeing care as important, equally important to, the GWIS and high-tech kinds of industries. That's a common theme in the foundational economy, but also thinking about how we meet human needs and address the climate emergency through, the development of care systems. And here again, this connects with another really important theme, the importance of the collective rather than simply just the individual. And how do we make the challenge, how do we meet the challenge of making a more progressive tax system to raise the funds we need? So often the elephant in the room is, how do we pay for all of this? So how do we connect the need for paying for things? And it was interesting that Lee talked about, how do we finance the forestry, the wood economy that we need? They said these are really important questions that perhaps aren't discussed enough. And this relates to, I think, as soon as we start thinking about planting trees, we have to think about the very long term. And whether we're trying to think about how do we remake care, how do we coordinate processes like housing retrofit that we discussed this morning, how do we take the journey of decarbonisation with citizens rather than giving people lectures about what they need to do, and how do we do all of this in a collaborative way? This really is a challenge because it requires a long-term way of thinking, which is sometimes at odds with the kind of political cycles. And then yesterday, we had a session on national projects, and James Mitchell at the end of his talk about Scotland, and interestingly, his view is that the Scottish government has had very limited engagement with the foundational economy. James Mitchell cited Machiavelli on what he called the difficulty and the danger of initiating a new order of things. And that really struck me, that phrase, because I think that's a really nice way into the foundational economy in Wales. And we could kind of characterise the foundational economy in just this way. What we're trying to do is initiate a new order of things, which in Machiavelli's terms can be both difficult and dangerous. But I think it's also the case we need to remind ourselves, and this came through in these talk, that it's also incredibly hopeful and meaningful, and that nothing will happen unless we have the ambition to do it. So on that note, I've got two questions for Lee. The first one is taking the foundational economy agenda forward within government. And obviously there's a lot of discussion about silos and governments, and to that end, the creation of a kind of super climate change ministry is a huge advance in theory in terms of breaking down the silos. And Lee, your agenda shows that you're obviously determined to make the most of the opportunities you've got in your foundry. So foundational economy is kind of broken out of the economy ministry. It's going beyond that. But is it possible to think about the foundational economy as a kind of cross-government theme or project rather than something that kind of sits more in one ministry than another? And how do we do this? And how do we deal with the challenges on the way about, these big parts of the economy, education and health, which clearly are things which are much more controlled by the devolved government, but aren't always well connected with the foundational agenda? Because it's clear if we want to deliver for society, we've got to sort of think about the economy of health, the economy of education, and, go beyond procurement in this. And to that end, Cadeirydd Cymru produced a very a good report, I think, last year on arguing for further education colleges as key institutions in terms of the staff, the buildings, the networks, the capabilities that you have in communities. Then my second question is kind of reflecting on the role of government. How should Welsh Government and local authorities more effectively enable and support communities and organisations in the reimagining of the foundational economy and in the renewing of the foundational economy, whether that's community managed forestry or community energy, or in coordinating all the different organisations that need to work together if we want to achieve our sort of our key goals of making a good life for all. So that's the end of my comments.
Many thanks, Julie. Lee, shall we just move on to Andy and Gary, and then we can address them all together? I hope you've got a pen handy to take down a few questions. Andy, over to you.
Diolch, Kevin, and thanks, Lee, for a fantastic provocation, I think, to us all around that with some great examples. And just picking up on Julie's point, I spent a chunk of time this last summer down at White Sands, staring into the eyes of someone who was 1,300 years old, as I excavated skeletons from the sand dunes at the beach. And it really gave me time to think about the generations that we don't think about in terms of that long-term planning. As you know, in government, long-term is thought about 5 years or 10 years, not 1,000. And I'd love to think that we at a Wales level could start to really get our heads around these future generations and recognise that when we are talking about future generations, we have the ability to think 5, 6, 7, 800 years forward in terms of decisions we make about some of these things. So that was I think a great piece. I love in particular the forestry call to action that you've got there, and the idea that we discussed previously over Twitter about that's so deliverable with every 12 to 18-year-old in Wales planting 32 trees a year. Growing 32 trees a year from seed would be enough to plant 85 million trees within the timescale that you've got. So it's so doable if we take this down to that smaller level. And I think in terms of funding this kind of stuff, we've got, as you'd be aware, we've got £85 billion of pensions and ISAs in Wales, 80 or 85 billion. And almost none of that is invested in Wales's future. And I think there's a huge opportunity to imagine how do we take 5, 10, 20% of that and put it into projects that we can really work on that space. And I think for me, this, as someone who lives in a timber frame house, the idea that's been missing for me in all of the developments I've seen across Wales is the chance of giving people the chance to build their own houses using timber that's come from the hills of Wales. And when the multiple house builders are taking one house in every 3 is 100% profit, we know where the value can sit in the foundational economy about building the skills for people to really take longer, take 3, 4, 5 years to build a house, but save money, build skills, and start to build communities of diverse housing as well as diverse perspectives. I love the principle that you discussed about aggregating demand. And I think too often what we forget in the process of composting in the garden, composting doesn't work when you put a bucket of garden waste together. You have to put a pile together. And when you put a pile of waste together, you get a difficult chemical process. And for me, there's this huge opportunity to aggregate that demand. And I guess one of the examples would be in the area of health that you talk about. We know the cashable benefit of type 2 diabetes by getting people out and about in communities in different ways is around about £300 million a year. The bit that really excites me is in the food space, whereby if we apply models like the Hisby model in Brighton, which is an impact-based supermarket, we could get the food that kind of food budget you're describing of maybe £2 billion being spent in supermarkets, spent in impact-based food shops. We'd put £1 billion a year back into the Welsh economy for free and eliminate half of the packaging, which has a huge climate benefit. I think we need to think so much bigger in the way we do that. So I guess the couple of questions for me that I've learnt from the work we've been doing with Wales Transition Lab, bringing together people from different sectors to talk in different ways, as the way that you've been starting, is to say, is there a minimum viable competence we need to build amongst all the players that have been part of these discussions around climate and nature and well-being and plastics and net zero, whatever, so that there's a functional literacy that allows us to talk about the future rather than have to start from scratch every single day? And at a wider level, if we really are going to build the foundry for the foundational economy, which I think is a fantastic image to hold in mind, what's the way that we can connect, as Julie calls for, that cross-department brief where every single child in every Welsh school grows up with an unshakable ability unshakable confidence in their ability to make a difference, because they've already made it by solving real world challenges about this work as part of their curriculum. Because right now, we hear too often in government people saying, we'd love to do that, Lee, but we're risk averse. And usually when people say I'm risk averse, it means I'm action averse. And the decisions that we're going to take are interested in the short term. If we want to properly prepare for risk, the risks that we know ahead, our entire workforce going forward will be able to deal with what's coming. So I'd love your thoughts on how we build some standards around minimum knowledge so that we can have a much more grown-up conversation about that aggregated ambition and properly build that, properly build the future that hope can live in. Diolch yn fawr, thank you.
Many thanks, Andy. We'll go straight away to Gary to conclude the responses. Gary.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thanks everybody. I've managed to dip in and out of the 3 days, and it has been truly inspiring. I don't normally get the luxury of hearing people talk about social care and taxation, and actually it gave me a huge amount of hope that actually the solutions are really there. People have done a lot of the thinking, and now it's really about how we apply that thinking to create transformational change. And I think transformational change for me isn't throwing everything up in the air and seeing what happens. It's got to be incremental. There's no other way to do it, but we have to accelerate those increments and make it faster and faster. And I'll touch on that in a minute. But I love what Andy says about the next generation and how we give them the space and the freedom to really flourish. I mean, what encourages me about the next generation is they're not quite as binary as my generation in terms of black and white. You know, there's not two genders anymore. There's lots of genders. You know, it isn't socialism or capitalism anymore. It's what works. And for me, the foundational economy is also about, you know, what works, but what works for people, taking people as a starting point, what creates this better life, as Julie talked about. So the bringing together of the foundational economy and the climate emergency it's kind of heaven sent. And actually I had the fortune to meet Julie James the day before Perdid, the day before the elections, and I did my usual Woody pitch, and she said, well, you don't have to do that with me, Gary. I've already bought in. I don't know what's going to happen in the election, but you know, if I get back in and if I have a position, I'll do what I can. And I thought, great, brilliant. That's as good as I could ask for. And then we had the elections. Labour did fantastically well, and we had Julie James and Lee Waters as Minister and Deputy Minister for Climate Change. It was like the sorry for, you know, I hope this isn't embarrassing, but it was like the dream team. I actually managed to persuade my wife that we could crack open a midweek bottle of wine. And, you know, we're not normally big on politics as being the route for change. So that was pretty exciting. And the super ministry was the icing on the cake. I mean, it was almost unbelievable to join up all the things that matter to me about forestry and timber, which is the housing regulation, planning, and the environment, and the trees. It was only actually in the coming months when I thought, why haven't they got all the other things in there as well? In fact, why haven't they got everything in there? Because it's all joined up. It's all part of a system that we need to change. But, you know, okay, we can't have it all, but we've got a pretty good shot at it now for the next 5 years at least. And that creates a new challenge for me. So I'm a construction engineer. I've been championing better ways of building, not just with timber, but other materials and reusing materials and the circular economy for 20, 25, 30 years. And mostly I would say operating despite government, not because of government. And so trying to make good things happen in an environment which isn't encouraging good things, let's be honest. And actually that's changed now. We now have a government which is absolutely committed to making these good things happen, and then it doesn't make you sleep any easier, because then you feel a responsibility for, right, okay, so actually now we're going to have to make it happen. So you know, in my sphere, in the work that I do with Wood Knowledge Wales, we're very well supported by the housing associations, all committing to build with timber and use timber products and procure locally. We have the timber frame manufacturers all committing to use homegrown timber and to play their part. And a point there I'd like to make is that actually, in my experience, most of the companies, and I work very much in the private sector, most of the companies we work with involved in the timber supply chain actually want to be on the right side of history. They want to play their part. They want to be part of something bigger, and it's how we actually support them to do that in a system where they have to make a profit. So you know, I think the businesses are on our side. I mean, Lee talked about this with the PPE. It's quite inspiring when you work with them. They are there to make a profit, but nearly all of them, I would say 95% of them, are also committed to being good citizens and doing the right thing. And the climate emergency, of course, is not just affecting the oldies like us, it's the future generations that are going to impact. And, you know, we've lots of them got kids and all of that stuff. So there is no shortage of will to make the transformation work right across in the sector that I work in, right across the timber supply chain. And we actually run lots of communities of practice with the small processors, with timber framers and housing associations, architects and designers. We didn't know they were called communities of practice, and actually until the foundational economy thinking came along, which is great. It gives it some kind of context. It's really those communication platforms are actually key to making the transformation work and critically accelerating the transformation, because they're the practitioners. They know what it takes to implement change from a practical level, and they can inform best practice really quickly, share knowledge really quickly with their peers, and that's what we've got to do. So I think a proliferation of these networks is absolutely key, and Welsh Government to give the inspiration that central focus, that central purpose, which I think came across loud and clear from Lee's presentation. So there's numbers of challenges which Lee's addressing. I was involved in Lee's deep dive for trees and timber, and that was great and exciting and exhausting for me. I don't know what it was like for Lee. Must have been pretty hardcore, and I can't believe he's doing another one, but on renewable energy. Lots of successes and lots of great things happening, particularly with the housing associations. I think, as Andy pointed out, there's a really big missing piece with self-build. We have got chronically low levels of self-built, self-procured housing in Wales. And this isn't just middle-class housing for the middle classes. In places like Austria, 80% of housing is self-procured, and that's a big driver for quality. So I think, you know, there are enabling things that government can do, not just through the social housing world. In terms of social housing, the new Welsh DQR 2021 is also a dream come true in terms of encouraging whole life carbon and high performance buildings and local supply chains. But we need that to flow through all construction, not just social housing. Shouldn't put all the burden on social housing. But the big challenge, and Lee talked about it, is the quantities of trees that we need to get in the ground. And I suppose my question for Lee, and we've come up with a range of interventions in the deep dive, but my big question is how confident is he that we can create that change of land use? And it doesn't have to be sweeping conifers all across Wales. I mean, let's face it, conifers cover about 7% of Wales. If we doubled the conifer cover, we would actually produce as much timber as we consume, which I think is a good start. That would be 14%, still not huge, but the resistance from NGOs and from the farming community to date has been big, and that's a big cultural challenge. And so it's more of a, I don't expect an answer, Lee, really, but more of a point of conversation as to how we handle that. Thank you.
Gary, many, many thanks to you as well. Before we go to Lee, I just wanted to mention the three of the key themes or questions, beginning with Julie's really, really important point about how do we get cross-government or whole government working in Wales. Anyone who's dealt with Welsh Government for the first 21 years of devolution will know that, you know, it's easy to talk about co-production, but co-production, like charity, begins at home. And getting co-production within Welsh Government itself has been an enormous challenge. And Lee's super ministry, if you will, is a good start in terms of trying to tie departments together. But it would be great to hear Lee talking about how the challenge of whole government working. Andy raised an enormous number of issues, but I just wanted to point out one danger, Andy. We're all in favour, I guess, of aggregating demand, particularly for public procurement. But sometimes when we aggregate it, as we've done in food in the NHS and given it to NHS shared services, they've ended up extolling price over quality, and the aggregation has aggravated the problem. It's totally wrong weighting in NHS food procurement between price and quality, and we really must target those people and put some pressure on them on that. And then Gary raised a whole series of questions, but I wanted to mention one where I thought that he'd pointed to the new way of working. I was so impressed with the work that you did with foundational economy, with Julie and Carol and others on serious about green, Gary, because not only did that identify the problem, but in perfect foundational terms, it also framed a solution by identifying the need for coordination capacity and who are the agents for coordinating the players in the wood economy. So, you know, we're not just talking about identifying problems for Lee, but we're also showing the chinks of light, as it were, and these are the ways forward, which I think was in keeping with his own presentation. Anyway, Lee, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. I was slightly nervous to respond to a semi-academic setting because I had my end-of-term report yesterday from Carol Williams, whom we met in Bangor, and the first thing he said to me within the first couple of minutes was, Lee, I've always thought you're very sloppy but well-meaning. So that was me told. So with that caveat that please forgive the sloppiness. Just to acknowledge, I did name checks of Debbie and Kevin and Carol in my comments, but I just, it's always a mistake when you start to thank people, isn't it? But just a couple of honourable mentions, really. So I'm conscious, Carol in particular, and it's a team, and he is the front man. So Julie Froud has made an enormous contribution, as has Colin Haslam and Sukhdev Johal, who I don't think is in the conference, and others, and those who have helped. I see Steve Cranston and Adrian Roper on the call as well in the Foundational Economy Challenge board were made a helpful contribution to, and Gary has been brilliant on the timber deep dive, and just as we talk about in the lines of change, we've got to have in the lines of accountability as well, because we all own these problems, not just the Welsh Government. And one of the things that always used to frustrate me when I was at the IWA was you can convene a meeting anywhere in Wales, and at some point in that meeting, everyone's going to come up with a list of demands for the Welsh Government, rather than a list of things that can be done in a distributed leadership sort of way. One of the things that strikes me every day in the Welsh Government is how few people there are. And I think this is the elephant in the room that we need to talk about here. We can come up with a long wish list, and they're all essential things, but who's going to do them? We have a small number of people in the Welsh Government, and they have been depleted by austerity, and it's a real capacity is a real challenge for us in doing all the things we want to do. Very often in the policy area, you'll have one, sometimes half equivalent part-time working on an important policy area that in Scotland you'll have 20 people, and in Whitehall you'll have 50 people working on. So that is a real constraint for us. So Kevin's comments about silo thinking and silo working in the Welsh Government are not unfair, but they don't just apply to the Welsh Government. I dare say, Kevin, heretical as it is suggested, they may also apply to Cardiff University or any large complex organisation. Silo thinking is an inherent danger in large complex organisations.
Lee, can I just say, Cardiff University will give any organisation a run for its money in silo stakes.
There you go. So I think this is messy, isn't it? Government is messy, and the point that you've all made about and I can't answer all these questions. These are fair questions. They're open questions for us all. how do we deal with cross-government working? That is the big challenge. It is hard because there isn't just one policy imperative, and there isn't just one worldview. You know, it's competing and colliding agendas, and you just trying to marshal this messiness to try and deliver an outcome that that can get most agreement. That's the way these things work. And you know, and I think, you know, I'm tempted as I am to agree with Gary's solution to this, just give everything to me and Julie to do. You know, we're bloody exhausted as it is, Gary. There's a lot on. So I think my focus is, and this was, I hope, came out of my comments, is there's a bunch of stuff we can do in this portfolio on the foundational economy to really take it forward. Let's focus on that, and let's show that this is a good thing to do, that other parts of government will follow. There is real interest from other ministries in it too. Alina Morgan, I know, is really interested in the health services contribution. So we are. I'm hoping that we are going to bring together a cross-government group of ministers to take forward the foundational economy agenda. But you know, this is tough stuff. Is all I would say. And you're absolutely right to make the challenge, and you should keep making the challenge. I don't have a simple answer for it. I think it's doing what we can with what we've got to show that this is the right way to do it. I think is the best I can offer, honestly, on that. I think Kevin's point at the end there about the danger of aggregation is a very, very fair one. And I saw that working closely with shared services during the PPE crisis. And I suppose, you know, it's not dissimilar, Gary, and if you think, but NRW's approach to selling of timber as well, you know, because in a sense that's aggregating, isn't it? And it's by putting it out for commercial auction. And what NRW have done by setting aside 30% of its timber stock for non-market uses, I think is a really important step forward. And what the NHS have done in agreeing a foundational economy programme of reform and fund is also real progress. None of these have been easily won because they are competing agendas, and the NHS shared services, to be fair to them, were set up to drive down costs because the health budget is always under enormous pressure. And, you know, we shouldn't be flippant about that, because, you know, in the spirit of cross-government working, it's in all our interest to have a fully functioning, ambitious health service as well. So there is tensions between these agendas, but I think we have made real breakthroughs in the last year on getting the NHS to agree to look at a new public policy procurement statement that Kevin had a big hand in shaping. That's a start. We've got an exercise underway to look at a procurement centre of excellence that Sophie Howe's office made the case for, as did Kevin's panel that looked at the procurement projects in the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund, and Rebecca Evans and I were able to take over the line. Big steps forward, and again the NRW announcement is a big step forward. So I think we are pushing forward, but it's not always even, and it's not always ideal. I think Andy's point about getting every 12 to 18-year-old to plant 32 trees a year is an interesting one, because it does give you the sort of scale of the challenge ahead of us. And then Gary's point about how the confidence levels, how can we plant these trees, is also good. And I've been having some quite robust conversations with farmers and their allies in the media over the last week or so. And there really is, and Carol has made the point that one of the barriers to behaviour change in farming is what he describes as socio-cultural issues, which I think is bang on. You know, not all of this is rational. And I've been in Hisfasi Agricultural College this morning, and I had robust conversations with them about this as well. It is not going to be easy. But I think the broader principle applies here, and for me this applies to the whole climate change agenda, and I guess it feeds into this as well. We've got to make the right thing to do the easy thing to do. Currently, it is not. across transport, across all sorts of behavioural change challenges. And it's certainly true in forestry, and that's what the deep dive identified. It's bloody hard to plant a woodland, and we're going to make it easier. But it's going to be very hard to persuade generations of farmers to shift from what they've always done to do something different. And let us not pretend it's going to be easy. But I think putting in the socio-cultural lens on this project is really important. And we need to have sort of, the psychology and just as we have in the DNA project, the Data Nation Accelerator that we're doing on digital and AI with universities, where they take a multidisciplinary look. They put engineering and computing and ethicists and psychologists together to look at the problem. And I think we need to do something similar here. This is not just a rational exercise. I'm not sure I'm effectively answering all of these good points. I didn't really understand Andy's question about having a minimum viable competence and functional literacy. Well, I understand what the words mean, but I'm not really sure I understand how to go about doing that beyond, the broader conversation we're having about behaviour change around climate change. We are looking now at a broad-based behaviour change set of campaigns looking at energy and transport and others all in one, because I think ultimately this is going to be about values, and that's what worries me about this whole agenda, really, because there's a positive case for saying once rooted in values, just as we made the case for organ donation change. That's a way you can communicate and get people bought into a change program. The thing I really worry about climate change, and particularly seeing it in transport through active travel and 20 mile an hour speed limits and so on, is this is getting caught up in the culture wars. And that, the danger is we other this agenda, and I think that is going to make it extremely divisive and difficult, as we are seeing now through COVID. And I think that is happening, and it worries me about it, which is why, I think we need to sell these benefits not just in climate terms, but in everyday benefit terms. And that's why I think the foundational economy lens and framing is so important, because it has a climate benefit, absolutely, but it has other benefits that maybe have greater salience to people in the short term. And I think that's important. Kevin, are there any other key points that I've failed to properly engage with?
No, I think you've done a heroic job covering what you've already done. Just on that final point, we'll send this to you. But in the first session today, we had one of the countries, the UK's leading environmental psychologists, Lorraine Whitmarsh, talking exactly about how to create sustainable behaviour change and how to avoid climate policy falling victim to the culture wars by framing the benefits in terms of multiple dividends. She says, she summed it up by saying something like, "Hello green, bye bye blues," and that philosophy, that soundbite, is based on a lot of solid research, and I think you should see that, Lee, because I think it's helpful to frame your climate policy in more benign ways to avoid us falling victim to, as Carol said, the framing of the Daily Mail.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are working and talking to Lorraine. I think that's essential. I completely agree.
Good. We're aware that you were tired. Time is getting on. Are there any final comments or questions for Lee? Because we don't want just this to be a question and answers. That's a rather tired format. But anybody bursting to me? Lynn, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I have, if you can hear me. Just a question for Lee, really, trying to tie some of this together around the planning system and development within Wales. I went to a session today about the Atlantic Wharf regeneration program that would include a 15,000 seater arena, 1,000 homes, 4 hotels, offices, art centres, and so on. Awareness of the climate implications of transport and energy consumption, but virtually none when it comes to embedded carbon and building materials. This is all steel, glass and concrete. And the same is true of other major proposals, certainly in Cardiff, like the embankment for 2,500 homes, or the many towers that are proposed in and around the city centre. And I was wondering what can be done at a Welsh government, but also at a local authority level, because the Atlantic Wharf development, Cardiff Council will actually be a joint applicant, to make sure that the embedded carbon element in climate change is tackled.
Lee, any thoughts or comment on that?
Well, my main thought is your plea for not having a question and answer session didn't go terribly well.
I know.
I'm happy to. I know Gary's got his hand up. Do you want to take
Gary.
it?
Oh, well, I was only going to come in after. I was just getting in early, because when I hear people talk about embodied carbon, I get quite excited, as Lee knows. I think you're absolutely 100% correct that no consideration is given to that, and the emissions, no doubt, will be astronomical, way more than what will be released during the running of those buildings over their lifetime. What I can say is that embodied carbon has come into social housing policy in the new standard, which is pretty exciting. So Welsh Government have started on that journey. The only other thing I would say is I think planning guidance needs to be updated to take account of the climate emergency very quickly, because planners are one of the key barriers to good things happening in all sorts of areas of not just construction, but also all sorts of areas of land use. So yeah, really good point. That's all I wanted to say, Lee.
Thank you, Gary. That was helpful.
Lee, I know you're averse to Q&As, but we are aware of your long day. Carol has just put a marvellous question in the chat, and I thought it was a question that could sum up the session, really. That can you see it?
Just looking at it now. Well, I can see it. His question is, did you ever think we get as far as we have, and what explains that progress? Well, I'm definitely a glasses half empty sort of person, really. So I forever think we haven't done enough and haven't moved fast enough. So that's the nature of the way I look at problems, really, and I use that frustration to keep pushing forwards. But I think that's a fair and generous reflection by Carol, who is not known for his upbeat assessments. So I'll take that. So I think we have made progress, for sure. It's gone out of 5 years ago when I was elected. It was not a much discussed. Carol et al. Had produced their piece of work for Wales TUC and the FSB, and the idea was beginning to gain traction, I think. And I think we've taken it a long way into the mainstream over 5 years. It's still not in the mainstream, and it's still little understood. I think the language is still a struggle. I think the term of foundational economy is quite difficult to explain, and I haven't come up with anything better. So I think there's, I'm not satisfied that we've got the traction that we need, and that we have the broad-based push for change that we have. But I am focused on making gains where we can, and I think we have made gains, and we haven't wasted crises, and we're in a much better platform at the beginning of this Senate term than we were 5 years ago. And I think that has been, Carol, bigger, to use your phrase, because there has been an alliance for change. And I think I genuinely mean this. I think I've really been excited to be part of a project where academic research, professional practitioners and policymakers are working together, neither of them being greedy about trying to take ownership, or this was my idea, but a genuine shared sense of purpose and mission, and cross-fertilize, and an acceptance that it's imperfect. You know, I joked, Kevin, that you told me off for making clumsy comments about making it up as we went along, and that, you know, that was a crass way to put it. But in a sense, you know, we are feeling our way as we go here, and I think that's what's interesting and exciting about it. And it's limited for sure, but I think if we can keep up that determination and use the climate change momentum that we are building, I think in 5 years hence again, I think we'll have got a lot further still.
Very well said. Unless there's someone who wants to really make a comment before we conclude, please let me know now, because I'm just conscious of Lee's diary today. He's in the Llandudno office on his own there, and he wants a break as well. Anyone bursting to say something?
Yeah,
before? Andy.
Just a takeaway for Lee, I guess, is that I completely empathise with you, kind of saying, "Oh, great, Lee, it's up to you, to Julian, to sort all this out." I guess, do you remember that there are more volunteers in Wales than there are tasks for them to do? And I think at the minute I think we sometimes don't get asked to offer help when we can. And I think there's a massive untapped capacity in our communities that could help if we had better structures for releasing the talent and knowledge that's there, not to respond to now, but it's a lonely job trying to do this. And I think there are a lot more people we could tap into who could really help to move this if we can find the right forums for that.
I think that's a very fair point, and that's why I've put together the group on timber now on Renewal, is because I know all about lots of things really, but surrounding myself with people who I can draw, and I found to be quite an effective way of bringing about change. So don't wait to be asked is all I'd say.
Yeah, well, I honestly think this is a good point, colleagues, to end on this. Going back to a point that Lee made in his presentation about the need for distributed leadership, to get away from ending meetings with saying, well, here's 49 things we want Welsh Government to do, and instead reframing that as a form of more collaborative, distributed leadership, where we work in concert. That requires changes from Welsh Government's old command and control style of working more as a partner with civil society organisations, and it means us looking to ourselves at our own shortcomings, particularly the universities, for example, and trying to develop genuine co-production systems. And I think that's what foundational economy networks have really done in recent years. So can I, on behalf of all of us, Lee, can I take this time, A, for being so generous with your time, and also for being so generous with your ideas, and sharing knowledge in a typically frank and honest way. That's still, sadly, a very unusual attribute from our politicians, and we all respect you for doing it. So on that note, everyone, thank you for attending a late session, and many thanks for joining us at this conference. It's been a fantastic conference, and we owe it to our speakers and our participants. So many thanks, especially to you, Lee. Hwyl.
Diolch pawb. Nos da.